let's talk more about how to use the TI Texas Instrument Calculator. Again, I'm using an 84 plus CE, but a lot of these will be the same for other Texas Instrument calculators. Now, one of the most powerful things these calculators do is graphing, so let's actually look at how to graph. So to enter a graph, we're going to hit the y equals button, which is up here at the very top on the left. And you'll notice mine has a lot of different graphs, so I can type in multiple graphs if I'd like to. And you'll notice it did default on that equal sign. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Now let's say I just want to graph the line y equals x plus 1. So now, if you've noticed, there are alphabet buttons above a lot of my keys, and I can hit them by using alpha. But the much quicker way to get X is this button, which is right next to the alpha button. Those other options, T and theta, are for graphing in parametric and polar, if you would like to do so. So I'm just going to hit that button, and there's my X comes up automatically, and then type in plus 1. Just like when we do arithmetic in the main menu, when I graph, again, it should look like exactly what it looks like by hand. Now you can hit enter, you don't actually have to, but you certainly can. To actually see what the picture looks like, I'm going to hit the graph button way over here on the upper right. And that blue line gives me my graph. Now, let's do a couple of things with this graph. Let's first look at a table of x and y values. This is something we often want to have, and to do that, I'm going to hit second and then graph. Again, all the blue stuff which is above the buttons, to get that I access it with the second button. So I hit second and graph, and we can see quite a few options here. So for example, I've got -3, -2, -2, -1, 0, 1, 1, 2, and so on. I can also scroll up and down to get more values. Let me go back to the graph by hitting graph. Let's say I want a really small or really big graph. There are graphs where I might need to focus really close on something, or I might need to go way far out and get a big graph. So I can change my window. And I am going to hit window to do that. Now I'm not going to worry about that very first option. The ones I am going to worry about is where it says x min and x max, y min and y max, and then where it says XSCL, which is the scale. Now this is our default window, and we'll talk later about how to get back to this if I do change it. Let's say I want a really big window. Let's say I want to go from -100 all the way up to +100. Well, let's put in -100 for x, +100 for x max. Let's do the same for y. So my y min is -100 and my y max is +100. Do note if you get an error, probably what happened is that your minimum is larger than your maximum. The calculator set up the minimum for both x and y always has to be smaller than the maximum. So let's hit graph. Now you'll notice I've got a really thick line here. This line is thicker as well. It's a little harder to tell, but that line is definitely thick. So why did it do that? Well, basically what it's doing is these are all the little hash marks, as I like to call them. Go back to my window. That's where this little scale comes in. Again, I call those the hash marks, those little marks that we show to give you the scale. And because we're going from -100 to 100 for x, I've got 200. I've also got 200 on the y. Usually, if we're going to make the min and max different, we do usually change the scale. Not always, but we do. Well, let's say I want it every 10. So let's go ahead and change that to 10 for x scale, and let's do the same for y. And once again, then let's hit graph. Now, if you remember our -10 to 10, that pretty much looks the same here. The only way I can tell the difference is now it looks like it's going through the origin. Because this one's just x plus 1, it's really hard to tell that plus 1 because I made my graph really big. So it didn't really make sense for this graph. It might make sense for other graphs though. For example, let's say instead of x plus 1, I had x plus 50. And now let's graph. Well, it looks like we're going through positive 5 here and negative 5 here. Now again, I always tell students, if I'm not sure what number it's going through, or if I just want to double check, I can use that table. So let's hit second graph to pull up my table. And we can say here, oh, I'm not going through positive 5 and negative 5. I've got much bigger numbers here. Again, it was kind of hard to tell, though, when I had just the graph. Now let's say I had my original window, that negative 10 to 10. Now if I want to go back to my standard window, I'm going to hit this little zoom button, which is right here in the middle, and I'm going to go to option 6 here, which says Z standard. Now you can either scroll down till you get to it, or you can just hit number 6 on the number pad. And I am now back to my negative 10 to 10 window. I can hit window to double check. I'm back from negative 10 to 10. My scales are 1. My graph has disappeared though. Well, that's because I've got x plus 50. It's so high up I can't see it. So this would be a good example of, because my graph doesn't fit on this window, I might want to go in and change that window to something else. It all depends on what graph we're actually using. One final reminder here, let's go back to x plus 1 because we could actually see that graph, and let's see that again. Actually, let's go here and change that to x minus 1 because, as I always like to remind students, remember we've got to be very careful with how we type these in. Again, if I write these out, they look the same. So x subtract 1 is the one we just saw, but what happens if I hit this button instead? Again, this button is the negative button. So if I type that in, again, it looks very similar, but my calculator is going to interpret this as x times negative 1 because I don't have an operation symbol in between. And that graph is very different than x subtract 1. So again, please be careful whether we're doing actual subtraction or if I'm doing minus. The final note of caution is, let's say I do actually want to type in negative x. So I type in negative x, and I do get that graph that I just saw. But let's say I typed in that instead. So I hit the subtraction button and then x. If I hit graph, my calculator is going to give me an error message. And that's because I just told it to do subtraction. I'm going to hit 1 here for quit. So what I've told my calculator is I am subtracting x from something, but I didn't tell it what to subtract x from. And that's why it's giving me an error message. And that is a very common error message to see. I'm going to do other videos for how to do multiple graphs. For now, I just wanted to hit the basics of how to type in a graph, how to access the table, how to change the window, and then how to get back to my standard window.